Well, good morning, everybody. Here we are at the THSFW, the wonderful, what used to be science fiction group out of Tucson. Now we're global but not exploitively so, I hope. So anyway, today on July 6th, we are faced with a wonderful surprise, a whole bag full of surprises. So I hope you're ready for this. And I have one little housekeeping duty, and that is to advance the slides so everybody gets the idea. Now, if I can find the slide controls, we'll be in good shape. Oh, here they are. Here they are. Okay, so this is from my husband because he goes to lots of meetings with science groups and they have a list like this at his meetings. And I guess it's good to turn off your microphone unless you're speaking. Place your comments into chat. And if you want information on our speakers, you probably will know one of them, but we'll just, go on with this. We have our Tucson Hard Science SF channel, and there is a link to it. I didn't put the link, unfortunately, here, but it's on most of our emails. And if you didn't get it on an email, just email me and I will give it to you. We also have a spin-off theater group, a wonderful theater group. We're on to our third play now. And this is the complete production of The Crystal Egg by H.G. Wells. And I think we're up to 600 views on that little puppy. So we're very happy with that. And we're hard at work, but I won't go any further because there will be more to be said on the current one. And back to our little group, the Hard Science Planet Zoom Players. It's an offshoot. Do you do tech? Can you act? Have you written a play, or would you like to write a play or adapt a story or suggest a story that is in the public domain that you think is wonderful? Because many of the stories of classic science fiction, unfortunately, didn't have enough production things like, big blowing up planets. So they've never been made into films in Hollywood. So what we want to do is do some of these as videos and partially animated videos. So that is the end of these beginning slides. And now I'm going to share screen again, differently this time. If I can find what I had. I hope I still have what I was going to share. Wait a minute. I think I got rid of the thing I was going to share. So let me just bring it up again. This is our surprise visitor who has to be contacted through the ether. And he's an expert on surprise because he claims his whole life was ruled by surprise. He had an eminent life, world famous life, and yet he said it was all due to surprise. So let's hear what he has to say on that. And I do want to contextualize this just a bit for you because this person had a bit of a health problem before he made this video. He's older in this video and a little bit hesitant, not that much in his speech, but he's toward the end of his career, and he's going to speak to us today about surprise.
Couldn't afford to go any other way. Have you ever taken the Greyhound bus across to New York 4 days and 4 nights? No, don't do it. Especially 50 years ago when there was no air conditioning and no toilets, huh? So they stopped the bus every 2 hours and you ran out into the gas station and went to the men's and women's and ran back before the damn bus left, huh? I got in New York, stayed at the YMCA, $5 a week, huh? That's how poor I was. And I met all the editors, and they all said, well, don't you have a novel? I said, no, I'm a sprinter. I write short stories. Well, we don't publish short stories. They don't sell. And I was ready to go home, defeated. And the last night there, I had dinner with Walter Bradbury, no relation, from Doubleday Publishers. And during the dinner, he said, Ray, what about all those Martian stories you've been writing? What if you tied them all together in a tapestry and called it The Martian Chronicles? Do you think you could do that? He said, oh my God, Weinsberg, oh how, huh? Weinsberg, oh how. I did it, but didn't know I was doing it, huh? He said, I tell you what, write an outline on the book tonight, bring it to the office tomorrow, and if I like it, I'll give you an advance of $750. I stayed up all night at the YMCA. I wrote the outline for the Martian Chronicles, took it to Bradbury the next day, gave it to him. He said, that's it, here's $750. Now he says, do you have any other material that we could kid people into thinking was a novel? I said, well, I've got a short story about a man who has tattoos all over his body, and late at night when he perspires, the tattoos come to life and tell their stories. He said, here's another $750. So in one day, I sold the Martian Chronicles and the Illustrated Man without knowing what I was doing. You see, surprise! You don't know what's in you.
Ruben Gallego understands our sacrifices. Raised by an immigrant single mother, Ruben learned the determination it takes to achieve.
Until you test it, until you word associate. You've been writing self-consciously, intellectually for too long. The deep stuff, your true self, hasn't had a chance to come out. You've been so busy thinking commercially, what will sell, what will I do, instead of saying, who am I? How do I discover me? You word associate. Here's another thing you can do hygienically. Go to the typewriter and just type in, an old thing comes into your head. Start out word association. And by God, maybe by the bottom of the page or the second page, all of a sudden, some characters will take over. And they begin to write. And this will be your true self, your true fear, your true hope, your true love. Huh? You'll be writing a passion. You'll be writing with excitement. Huh? You'll be finding out things about yourself that you didn't even know you knew. Huh? And all the things in your past that you haven't touched yet. You haven't even begun to touch them. I'm still touching mine, you know? So I wrote those 2 books. And then Dandelion Wine happened the same way. I've always loved 4th of July. I've loved growing up in a small town where on summer nights, all my relatives would gather on my grandparents' front porch. There were 3 families lived on the same block. My grandparents, my father, my mother, my brother, myself in the next house, and the 3rd house with my Uncle Bion and his wife and child. And I was so fortunate because he had all the Edgar Rice Burroughs books, all of Tarzan, all of John Carter, Warlord of Mars. So I went over to the lending library at his house. Huh? And my Aunt Neva lived upstairs, and she had all the Oz books. So I had a second lending library right there in the house, along with Alice in Wonderland and the other fairy tales and what have you. And then I had the main library downtown. So between the 2 I had around the block with me and the library downtown, I was set, huh? I was really set. So, but I loved the idea of all my relatives coming from the various houses on a summer night and sitting on the porch and talking and talking. And you, if you were smart, you listened, huh? I loved to lie on the big xylophone of the porch, all the boards in the porch, huh? And all the voices would come down through the rockers and go into the boards and sound the boards and then come into my ear when I'm lying there, huh? And if the conversation lagged, I'd whisper, 1902, and my grandfather would tell us something about 1902, huh? Or my father, 1910, you know? And so I wrote an essay on this, about front porches and summer nights. And that was the beginning of something. And then I wrote, I was on a bus going somewhere 45 years ago, and a young boy jumped on the bus, ran down the aisle, slung himself into a seat across from me, and I said, oh God, if I had that energy, I could write a poem a day, a short stories a week, a novel a month, huh? What's the secret of his energy? And I looked down at his feet, and he was wearing the most beautiful pair of nice new white tennis shoes. Huh? I said, yes, I remember what it was like when I was a kid. My father would take me downtown every spring, and we'd take my heavy winter shoes and take them off and throw them on the floor. Wham! They went right through into the basement. They were so heavy with winter, huh? And then we put on a new pair of Lightfoot tennis sneakers, huh? And when you put them on, you can rock in them, and all the energy of the world is in them, all the lightning, all the storms, all the Indians running on dust paths, huh? All the energy of the world. And I got off the bus, went home, and wrote a story called Sound of Summer Running, huh? So I was on.
I want to introduce our speaker who is here, and hopefully he will have better luck. He can share with his own methods. Phil Nichols is our surprise guest, who is from our Planet Zoom players, and he is a real technology wizard. And we're so fortunate to have Phil talk about some of the ways that he incorporates chance and accidents and everything into his fantastic special effects that he does for all of our Planet Zoom plays. So Phil teaches at Wolverton University, and is it media arts?
Yeah, filmmaking, basically.
Basically filmmaking. So we have a real tech pro here today, folks. And with that, I will turn it over to Phil. Oh, and one other thing about Phil, he has is it the most popular blog on Ray Bradbury in the UK, right? Something like that.
Something like that, yeah. I mean, such things are hard to prove, but yeah.
I'm so pleased to have you here today, because we're actively involved with all of Phil's talents, and I just wanted other people to have the fun of getting to know him, and you're very approachable and very easy to work with, and that's saying a lot. So, okay, Phil, take it over, and I'll just start writing those names down.
Thank you. Shall I say something about Ray Bradbury before I talk
Go
about
ahead.
the?
Go for it. Yeah.
I, among other things, I'm a podcaster, and I do a podcast about Ray Bradbury's work, which is called Bradbury 100. And I'm also senior consultant to the Ray Bradbury Center, which is at the Indianapolis campus of Indiana University. And I did my PhD studying Ray Bradbury's screenwriting, so I know a fair bit about Ray. I met him a couple of times as well towards the end of his life. So we can talk some more about Ray in a while if anyone's interested in that. The main thing that Gloria asked me to talk about is the stuff that I've been doing with the Planet Zoom players. So this is where we're doing these audio dramas essentially, but we're trying to illustrate them. So I'm going to give you a sneak preview of the production that we're working on currently. As Gloria said a while ago, our previous play was an H.G. Wells piece. We're currently working on a story, a little known story by Lee Brackett, who's a writer who is in danger of being forgotten. She was a leading science fiction writer in the 1930s, 1940s, also a leading Hollywood screenwriter. And she's probably best known as one of the screenwriters for The Empire Strikes Back, the second Star Wars film. Let me share my screen with you. You can bear with me. Okay, so I'm hoping that you'll be able to see this.
If anyone can't see, can you say that you can't see anything on your screen at the moment?
And bear in mind, I can no longer see any of you. So I would need you to speak up. But hopefully you can see Lee Brackett's Terror Out of Space on the screen. Can somebody confirm that they can see that?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, we can see it.
We can see
Good,
it.
thank you. Thank you. Fantastic. So this is the play that we're working on currently. Now, when we've done these plays, they're always audio dramas, essentially. So it's actors just doing voice acting. And the idea was to put some visuals to these so that people will perhaps find them more engaging. Because although some of us enjoy radio drama, many people don't. And people don't know where to look when they're listening to a thing. So the idea here is to bring some visuals. In the previous one that we did, we used sort of archive imagery because it was an H.G. Wells story. I went looking for photographs of Victorian people, real people, that we could adapt into images representing our characters. And I also used some generative AI to create some characters. For this one, I started out with the AI route, but I very quickly switched to using 3D modeling. So I'll just click through some of the slides and you'll see some of the characters that we've got. This will look rather random because, of course, you don't know what the story is that goes with this. So here we have, this is the spaceship that's at the center of the story. That's an AI-generated spaceship. I described what I wanted to the AI and it created it. This is one of the characters. This is a 3D model that I made using a piece of software called DAZ 3D. Now, this isn't an animation. This is a series of still images with occasional bits of movement in them. And everything that you're seeing now is pretty much constructed by me out of a combination of 3D models, AI-generated images, and then bits of tweaking that I've done to the image to bring them to life. And this is one of our central characters who receives his orders from somebody on a screen. And in a moment, we'll meet his co-pilot. You've got to imagine there's some conversation going on here. So when you see the full production, you'll hear actors acting out the dialogue for these various characters. And as you can see, the co-pilot is asleep. And so the story goes on with this kind of imagery. It's imagery which suggests visually what's going on rather than depicting every single thing that goes on. Where the element of surprise comes in is that we're starting with a piece of text. We're starting with a short story, in this case from, I think, the 1930s. So it's already a story that's set in a pulp science fiction world. So you kind of have in your mind an expectation of what this ought to look like. Sometimes with stories from pulp magazines, you've also got illustrations because pulp magazines very often would have one illustration per story, so a kind of a line drawing. And there are some primitive illustrations that accompany this story when it was first published, but not many. So we don't get many clues as to what this world should look like. Except that it is descriptive to a degree of a sort of a pulp science fiction environment. So when it comes to visualizing it, you've got to look for indications in the original story as to what it should look like. You also can look at the script, and in this case, one of the members of the group wrote a script based on the story. So we're not working directly from the story, we're working from a script. The script is, I would say, indicative. It's showing what probably should happen. But as I design the visuals, sometimes there will be a thing that's impossible to visualize. So I might say, can we change the script to accommodate this visualization? Or I might come up with some idea that leads me to say, well, we can show this on screen. It doesn't have to be said. So we could take away some dialogue in order to allow an idea to be conveyed purely through the visuals. So there's a constant back and forth between the original story, the script, how I visualize and am capable of visualizing the scene, and what's in the script. So there's a constant back and forth. And of course, you've also got the additional element of performance. Once the actors start saying the words from the script, there may be some lines that don't work. So things have to be adapted to sort of fit the natural cadences of the performer. So it's a real juggling act, and we can't predict really how this is all going to turn out. And when we do the actual show, we will do this in real time. So the actors will perform their lines. I will sit here pressing buttons to advance these images based on the cues in the script. And it will all come together, or not, as we do a live performance. Then after the performance, we record the performance, and then I can go in and edit it just to make sure it's as smooth flowing as it can possibly be. And I suppose the other thing to mention is that there will be sound effects and music interspersed with all of this as well. So perhaps to make it a bit like a piece of old time radio, you know, with sound effects and music, or perhaps to make it more like a movie. The end result is something that I don't think you could describe it as an animation as such, because we're really working with still images. I don't have the time to fully animate this, but I've put hints of movement in these various slides. So there is a sense of animation within them. I think technically the best term for what I'm doing here is animatic. So I'm putting together a series of images, something like a storyboard, but that's got just enough life in it for the viewer to feel that it is a movie rather than just a series of static images.
Bill, I have a question. Could we show a couple of the really neat things from the other video, the H.G. Wells?
We could. Yeah, just give me a minute to find a good scene then.
Okay. I like where it turns the egg goes from black and white into color. That I don't know if that's too fine-tuned. Maybe it's hard to zero in on anything that small.
Let me see if I can find that moment.
You know, even the opening sequence and how you did that, piecing it together, that is uncannily like the caves curiosity shop. It was
right. Yeah.
That whole opening.
Yeah.
So these are quite different, and Phil, you were using different techniques on this to give it a very antique feel. This is like sort of Back to the Future in this one that we're working on, the Lee Brackett, the Terror Out of Space. But in the H.G. Wells one, Phil was using old archival photographs and then bringing in some AI to combine features and clothing, because it's very well, it really has that verisimilitude of costuming and the whole sounds of a Victorian business street. Lots of little things that it all came together, and evidently the people on YouTube are really enjoying it. There are other readings of the crystal egg, but I don't think there are any that are the type that we did. There may be one animated one out there or two with sort of cartoon level animations.
Okay, so hopefully you can now see some red curtains.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll press play.
There's a black oh, there it goes. Okay.
There should be sound with this as well, but if there isn't, it doesn't matter too much.
No,
but I'll shut up now and I'll just play maybe the first minute of this.
Oh, sounds good.
The late 19th century.
an antique shop. There is Mr. Cave, dusting his stock in his little curio shop on the High Street in the Seven Dials, an unfashionable part of West London. See his stooped shoulders? He has a couple of old-fashioned cabinets, and in the window some old fishing tackle, a couple of elephant tusks, an imperfect set of chessmen, 2 skulls of tigers and 1 human, a moth-eaten stuffed monkey, a blown ostrich egg or 2, and a dirty, empty fish tank. And, at the moment this story begins, a mass of crystal worked into an egg. Ah, dear Mr. Cave. He is well educated, but is in an unhappy situation. His wife, who is younger, treats him with contempt, as do his stepson and stepdaughter. He is in declining health.
Oh dear.
Oh, it's filthy out there, George. I was almost clean blown off the corner of William's greengrocer's.
Okay, I'll stop.
Yeah, that's a
Sure.
good opening, and it gives you a real feel for the difference. That's what I wanted to show, how different, and you're just as good in doing these very period retro things, which I kind of like. I like the retro ones myself.
Yeah. And what most people watching that are not really conscious of is that some of it is real and some of it isn't. So the first view we see of Mr. Cave's shop from the outside is a real photo. So that's a real shop, except the sign over the shop saying Mr. Cave's, that's been added in Photoshop. And in fact, Gloria did that initial first image. But then we see Mr. Cave come up, and he is an AI generated image, but he's not a single image. What I found in trying to produce this was I couldn't get full animation. That was just beyond, beyond my skill set, but also beyond the time that we had available to do it. So what I wanted to do was minimally allow Mr. Cave to at least turn his head so that we could see him looking face on, or looking to the side, or looking to the other side. Now, if you generate an image using generative AI, it's almost impossible to get the same image twice. So what I found I had to do was kind of treat each character in 2 parts. So Mr. Cave is actually 2 things. He's a body, which is AI, and he's a head, which is AI. And I could get different poses, and I could get different head position. But there were some severe limitations on what I could do, and that's why these characters tend to just come on the screen and stay there. But I think the result, the unintended result, is that every scene looks like a Victorian photograph, pretty much. And I deliberately kept everything in black and white or sepia all the time that we're in Mr. Cave's shop. But there's a section in the film, or in the play, where he is kind of mentally transported to Mars. And for those sequences, it becomes full color. And also it tends to fill the screen more as well. Most of the normal scenes featuring Mr. Cave have a background which is square. So the characters sort of spill out of the background, but it's a bit like looking at a very, almost like an Instagram picture. And, you know, it's a very square image. But when we go to Mars, it widens out to the widescreen image. So it's more like having a real landscape in front of you, even though it's a very fanciful image or set of images. So there's a certain amount of planning involved, but every time it's, firstly, what can I do to illustrate what's there in the script? But there's also how it's going to end up. Sometimes by accident, I'm not able to achieve a particular thing. So I do something else instead. And in some cases, I'll throw in a bit of animation, almost as a distraction from the fact that I can't get a character to turn around very easily, but I can get a character to move sort of closer to the camera, or give the illusion of that kind of movement. So you get accidental things emerging as you're doing. So that's the element of surprise, really.
I don't know, can you see my, anyway, what I thought was amazing was where you, it wasn't in the story, but where he was next to the Martian, and people haven't seen it, so they don't know what I'm talking about. But because he's trying so hard to understand and commune with them, they merge into it's really interesting how you did that, and it wasn't in the story.
Yeah. So I was just trying to make something more magical, really, I suppose, out of the images that were there. And just looking for opportunities to do interesting things. And with the one that we're doing now, with these 3D models that I've created, I could have made every scene a 3D model and then just grabbed images from that. But what I found is more flexible for me is I create the 3D model of each character and save that out as a still image, then make a 3D model of another character, save that out as a 3D image, and then I can position those images against a flat background. So I'm still using the same techniques that I used with Mr. Cave, but the way I'm originating the characters now is different because I've started using a different set of tools.
I have another question about your underwater scenes, and maybe you haven't done those yet, but it looks like you're planning to go into those and maybe move around a bit. Is that going to happen?
Yeah, I've just got to that part of the script now. There's a part of the script where this spaceship basically plunges into the sea of Venus, because this is a pulp story from the days when people thought that Venus was covered with oceans. And yeah, there's a sort of a lost civilization under the sea. So I've got to somehow bring that to life. I've done a few tests for that. But again, I don't know quite how it's going to turn out until I actually have a go at putting these things together. And then there are things like things that are not clear in the story. There's this alien creature at the heart of the story, which is referred to as she. And at one part of the story, she is described as being sort of inside a small cylinder. So she's not a full size like human character. But then later in the story, she is a human sized character, or appears to be. So it's sort of making decisions about how is she going to look. In a story, you can be vague about what something looks like, because you don't have to describe it in every detail. The reader will fill in the gaps, you know. But with this, it would feel a bit of a cheat if we didn't actually show the character. So you have to make decisions about, well, is she really tiny in this scene? Is she human size now? So I've still got some of that to confront, but and I'm sure there will be some surprises along the way there as well. What do people think of what I've shown so far? Is anyone intrigued by this?
I'm intrigued, and of course I work with you all the time, and I've been dying for this meeting to happen because we haven't had the time in our rehearsals to really just talk about all the things that you're doing. I'm sure many other questions are coming into people's mind, even something about what are we planning to do next, and we take suggestions. So if you have an old classic science fiction story and you're pretty sure that it's in the public domain, that's a legitimate question or comment. So just I guess you want to open it up to people, so go ahead.
Yeah. I see in the chat Bob has put impressive stills, so thank you. And Bob's also said an ocean Venus could just be a different planet in another solar system. And in fact, that's what we decided. It's actually called Venus 2 or Venus 2.0. And the idea is that the humans in the story have recognized that it is similar to the classic Venus. And so they've named it after that, but it's not our Venus. But I think in the original story, it is actually Venus because it was written in the 1930s. So I suppose that's another thing that we're doing. We are taking liberties with the story, but we're trying to find within the stories things that have some resonance for today. So I know Gloria and CJ, who wrote the script for this, have had long discussions about the characterization of she, because as written in the original story, it's quite dated and borderline sexist, at least. That's to be generous to it. But it can't really be that for a telling of the story today, because people would say, why are you telling this old hat story? So you've got to look for some meaning or resonance for today. And the same with the Mr. Cave piece. And one of the things that we did with that was link it to The War of the Worlds, which is obviously a more familiar H.G. Wells piece. We're not necessarily changing what's in the original Wells story, but we're certainly changing the emphasis of the story in order to sort of force that connection.
Still, that was the story. I found it. He did mention the Martian machines in the story. Yes,
yeah.
He actually did. So it was very minor. Yeah.
That's right. It's one line,
one line, yeah.
Which we could have ignored or not noticed, but instead it was really Gloria's idea, because Gloria wrote the script for that one. But the idea was, look at this. Here's something really significant that most people don't notice in this story. So that's interesting.
I see popping in little questions there about AI.
Yeah. Does AI write original stories? It does, but I've yet to see a good one.
And of course, our actors are all on strike for the potential of the jobs, the labor market that AI may rob them of.
Yeah. And that whole question of whether generative AI is plagiarism or not is, well, we do know that there have been some sort of fairly authoritative rulings that anything produced by an AI is not copyrightable, simply because it's not the product of a human. But then again, if it is plagiarized, it's probably more human than we think. So I think there are some very contradictory views about AI.
What about the thing that the Hollywood people are upset about, that their images can be made to act in whole ways that they never did, but it's them and they're owned by their studio to some degree. They're on a contract, not allowed to do things out. So that, I think that's where the human and AI becomes the labor issue, as I understand it, with many.
Yeah.
Am I right on that?
That's right. Well, that's one element of it. Yeah. But also writers are rather afraid of AI because they know that studios could use it to generate stories, maybe not to generate full scripts, but to use AI to generate initial stories, which can then be given to humans to sort of write out as full screenplays. So there are serious concerns over it. In our case, we're not using AI for the script at all. At most, I've been using AI to generate some images because I'm not actually a graphic artist. I'm a reasonable draftsman, but I couldn't. If you asked me to draw these characters by hand, I couldn't really do it because that's not my skill set. But I do have the ability to manipulate things. So I use AI to give me the kind of the first visualization, which I then pull apart and shape it how I want. But even the generation requires prompting. So you type in a prompt, and anyone who's played with AI knows that you can type in a prompt and get a result fairly quickly. But to get the result you want or the result that you need, you have to vary the prompt. You write the prompt, get a result, no good. Let me change the prompt. So you end up elaborating the prompt in quite a sophisticated way in order to get the image that comes anywhere near to what you're looking for. I see Karen has put in the chat, it is sexist, but tweeting could deal with this. So how do you go about spinning this into our very different and always changing world? I think for that, that's possibly something that Gloria could discuss, because Gloria's had a lot of discussions with our scriptwriter
Oh, right. And also I'll start with the H.G. Wells one because I had a couple objections right in the beginning about the shrewish character of what's her name? Myra, Myra? Wasn't that her name?
Mrs. Cave. That's all
Myra
I
Cave.
remember.
Yeah, and you know, women who are brought up in feminism didn't like that he was this dreamer and sort of likable, and she was very shrewishly always reminding him that we're low on money, and if it weren't for me thinking about the realities of the house and keeping things up, you know, you're a dreamer. Well, I came back with that this is often the way women have to be or did have to be, and it still goes on, that you have a partner who's strong in one area, which may be his empathy for different others and his dreaming. It's a perennial problem. And just the fact that she reacted as any normal wife would and wanted more of an equal partnership, and plus it was more common then. It would be anachronistic to play her a whole different way than Wells wrote it. I didn't find her exceptionally unlikable. I just felt that she was doing what she had to do. She had two children, and it wasn't an ideal marriage. But there are times when the people's view of how things should be gets in the way of the way that the narrative was set up. And I think you'll see these shrewish women all through Dickens, and it's very period. And so I convinced the critics to stick with Myra, the Myra that we had from the original story. And I think that Myra works very well. I don't think people judge her exceptionally harshly. She was younger, and women did marry for support for having a life. In those days, there weren't many things that women could do outside the home. So that one, and then we had a lot of discussions about both the character she and the character Control. And I didn't much care for the word control. It's just very hierarchical, very militaristic, which to be honest, I'm a peacenik, and it rubbed me the wrong way every time I heard control, 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 saying things to him. Well, it would have been mission control, and yes, she's wearing military insignia, but these are the realities of pulp fiction and the way things are set up. The military does collaborate in many areas with the space scientists, although I will say many of them, like my husband Bob, have very little to do with the DoD funding or any of that. And there are separate spheres there which get merged in this pulp fiction. And I think that that could be a little less strident, but you know, it is what it is. And it was the 30s. And it was basically a story that was building up to World War II. And we've toned down some of the us and them of it quite a bit. And by inventing this control character, that made the story more interesting, because otherwise it was all just narration. We would have had to have a narrator doing a big job, bigger than in the H.G. Wells story, I think. So at least she's a female. Again, that's anachronistic for the time of the story, but we decided we were going to untether it from being actually from the, what do they call it? Past futures or retro futures. Other stories, we might stick to the letter of what that can't happen, because that wouldn't be the way it was when that story came out in the pulps. But in this one, because of the look of it, it no longer looks like a 1930s pulp story. And the gender issues came up here and there and everywhere, because we're sort of mixing, you know, gender. We don't want it to get a lot of hate mail on YouTube. If it were done completely in the 30s, there would be a lot of women who wouldn't like this or that. And so we softened, I think is the word I would use, softened the characters a bit more than they were in the story. Does that sound right to you, Phil?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the character of Control, I in terms of visualizing them, I just decided, well, the function of the character, apart from the dramatic function, the sort of the job function of Control is, as you say, like a mission controller or an air traffic controller. So that was what I had in my mind. So I've sort of made Control look as if she's sort of in a military uniform, but it's clearly something to do with flight, you know. But also that's, as you say, that's our character. That's not Lee Brackett's character.
No, there is no control in it.
That's right. We're kind of, with that character, we're free to do what we like because we've invented it.
Right.
But other aspects of the story, if you change too much, people will say, why have you even bothered calling it Lee Brackett's Terror Out of Space? You know,
I felt that about H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, the one that they made around 1990 or 2003. It was in there. Yeah. I forget the actual year. No, it was more into the 2000s. But where they had the moon all in chunks, and none of that was in H.G. Wells. It had totally shifted from the Morlocks and the Evoi. They were totally differently envisioned. So I was at the point of saying, why bother calling it, you know, the Time Machine if you're not going to. I was going to see all those Morlocks and Eloi, and they were unrecognizable. So
yeah. Some other comments. Bob has said, so our Daniel Olivor can't get credit. So that's an Asimov reference, I seem to recall. I can't remember which book that character's from, but
I don't know.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. And then Karen says, yes, Gloria, and the character could be tweaked to highlight what you say for the reader's interpretation. Yes, I think that's right. And then Bob says retrofuturism is the past's view of what the future would be like. And I think that's right. And I think it would be nice with some of these old stories to try and reflect the world as it would have appeared to the writer at the time. And I think that's what we tried to do with the H.G. Wells one. But with this one, we're sort of in a halfway house. I mean, it's kind of presented as if it's a modern day science fiction story, but there are some things in the story that I think you've got to recognize. It's a bit pulpish, so probably a more pulp image is called for. I mean, particularly when our character goes under the ocean of Venus 2.0, and he meets I can't remember what these aliens are called, but there are sort of manta rays swimming about, and there are little men. I can't remember what they're called.
Little flower people, aren't they?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So it's a flight of fantasy, really. Once we're under the sea there, so you can't approach it really as being hard science fiction, but nor do you want it to be Alice in Wonderland. You know, you want it to be sort of plausible but fanciful. So it remains to be seen what we come up with when we get to that part of the story.
Any other of you have a question or comment?
Bob says, trouble is that most of the audience today doesn't know what the Victorian era thought about. Yeah, that's probably true. But I think people do sort of recognize imagery that suggests that time. I think people lose the ability to distinguish decades. So, you know, if you made a film and you said it's set in the 80s, some people looking at it would see immediately that it's set in the 80s. Other people wouldn't notice that it's set in the 80s. Depends when you're born as much as anything. But I think when you get as far back as 100 years ago and 150 years ago, the world is so very different to our present world that people instantly recognize that they're in the past. And it's partly to do with things like horses rather than cars and that kind of thing.
That's
and the costumes, of course, as well.
Well, these are all. Go ahead. Sorry. I heard a voice, unless that was an echo of me. These are the many dimensions of things where we have accidents, or we find through surprise that we can do something we hadn't even. In the process of writing, where I taught writing in college, our process model, we have a process model, and that is that some people think writing is just putting down your pre-thought thoughts, your prefabricated thoughts, and it's only just transcribing them. That's what the act of writing is. But no, when we teach college writing, it's to show people by doing that they haven't thought of everything that's going to be in their final draft. And there's never really a final, you just stop at some point. But they often will think of things. You will find new, if it's a persuasive essay, you'll find new ways that you hadn't thought to persuade, or new kinds of evidence. Or if you're in an expository writing about explaining something, a process or anything, there will be parts of it that you'll throw out that's not major enough, other things that you'll develop. And that's the equivalent of what Phil is doing, where he will have something in his mind going into it that will do this, or maybe a storyboard, just scenes. But then as he actually tries to execute those scenes, that's where he makes all these decisions, discoveries, or disappointments, where he thought he'd just do something that would be easy, and turns out it isn't. And I was just going through that this morning, and Phil was trying to help me. I had a still photo, and normally you just can get the backgrounds off of them very easily, but this one was, for whatever reason, I may have to use a totally different figure. I'm not going to spend years on it. So I hope that if you yourselves, the people who showed up this morning, are not feeling like you want to try acting or being involved in these theatricals, please tell people about it so they can view it. But also, you may have family members or friends who are involved or like to read plays. We're really eager to have 2 people for every role. And for our plays so far, we may have 1.5 people, or one person who could, in a pinch, go over and do this, even though she's already fully occupied doing other things. But it's nicer if you have enough people in your group that you don't have a bad surprise, like someone is sick and you were scheduled to record it that day. So I think every amateur or community, they don't like the word amateur anymore, community theater has this problem of not having enough understudies or backup cast. So, but keep us in mind, because we are welcoming with open arms anybody who wants to be in our group, including writers who would like to, adapt something that's already a story. And then if you haven't done it before, you get to learn how to do it through our group, because we're people learn by doing.
In the chat, Bob is chickening out.
Yeah, I haven't been able to entice him into any of these theatrical things, or Chris. I don't think Chris has. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But Chris is very artistic, although he does a lot of drafting all week long, so it may not be that he wants to tackle anything else. But go ahead.
Can I tie this back to Ray Bradbury, who
Sure.
you started this with? Ray Bradbury, he was talking in that clip about surprise. Now, part of the reason that he believed in surprise is because he was terrified of writer's block. He knew lots of people who'd suffered from writer's block, and he was terrified that he would suffer from it as well. So he developed a writing process that involved him basically subconsciously or unconsciously writing. So he would sit at his typewriter and literally just type and let the words flow. And he had a little sign on his typewriter that said, "Don't think," because he believed that the minute you stopped to think about what you were doing, it would all fall apart. And he was terrified of that. So he developed this process which worked for him throughout his writing career, which was a 2-stage process. He would write unconsciously. Some of it would be good, some of it would be terrible. He would put it away in the drawer, and then later that same day, he would pick up something he'd written previously. And now, in this 2nd stage, he would go through it with his editor's pen, and he would edit and rewrite and redraft and sometimes retype a story. So his stories were always done in this 2-stage process, the unconscious stage, which is where some of his most imaginative ideas come from, because he's not thinking about things. But then he tightens the stories up in this second stage. So although he used to talk to people about the value of surprise, he was actually an incredibly good story analyst and an incredibly good editor of what he had written. And that's why some of his, well, certainly some of his early short stories are perfect. You know, they are note perfect because he's gone through this two-stage process. And some people would say, well, that's left brain and right brain. You know, I don't know that he ever had that model of how things were working. But yeah, he truly believed in the element of surprise, but he did also believe in the value of the intellect in noticing when something was good and keeping it, and when something was bad and throwing it away.
I want to say something about his productivity, because he could write a story a week. And the first few days or the first couple days, it was that generate, you know, get it all out. Then the middle of the week, he would be editing till he got down to Friday. That's when he popped it in the envelope. And in that same talk that I wish you'd been able to all hear it better, but it's outside of that frame. I'll give you the link to the whole talk when I send it to people who weren't able to watch it. He says that, you know, he really discouraged people from writing novels. He said, because if you're unknown, you're going to spend a year to a year and a half, 2 years working on something and it might not sell. He said, if you're like me, you can churn out a story every week. And there are lots of little markets, maybe not as many now as in the pulp era, but he was thinking back. There are so many markets for your short stories. Just keep mailing them off. And you can have 52 stories to market in a year. And he said, surely some of those are going to be good and some of those will sell. But this was a man who didn't take days off either. He kept working.
And if you look at his actual publication record in the early years of his writing, you'll see in the first year, he maybe published 1 or 2 pieces. The next year, 4 or 5 pieces. And then I think about his 5th year of being a professional writer, all of a sudden he's got like 20 to 30 pieces that are being published in magazines. And this is precisely because he wrote every day. He aimed to send out a story every week. And that meant, as you say, by the end of the year, there's 52 stories in circulation. Now, some of these are going to go to one magazine, be rejected, and then he'll send them out to another magazine. Rejected, send them out to another. So the stories would stay in circulation. And sometimes, if they were not a good story, they'd stay out there for 3, 4, 5 years. But by that time, he'd become famous. And so people were willing to buy the stories that were second rate simply to have his name on the cover of their magazines. So he was sort of raising himself by his bootstraps, really, by doing that. And then he had this genius way, which we saw in the clip, of recycling the stories. So you take your short stories that you've published in magazines and you've already been paid for, you now stitch them together with new material to make a novel, and you can sell that. So he was constantly doing this. I just saw some things pop into the chat there. Oh, Bob says, what if you send a story to 2 editors at the same time and they both accept it? Well, you don't do that. And I think the normal protocol is you only send it to one person at a time, and you wait for the rejection before you send it out again. Otherwise, you can get in a mess. I got in a bit of a pickle once with an academic paper that I sent to 2 journals. And I got 2 acceptances of the same paper. And oh my God, what am I going to do now?
Well, I hope we had a good session and that though it's given you something to think about, those of you that haven't ever worked in animation or on special effects. We're very fortunate to have Phil. I think he's the glue that holds the Planet Zoom players together. I just wish there were more of us Zoomers zooming around, but we're working on it. So any other comments from the audience here, the participant audience? Well, I guess we will have to wrap it up then. And this will be going on to YouTube, and I think it's going to be used. The only thing, Phil, I want to maybe excise that minutes of not being able to hear Ray Bradbury. I guess I can just chop that out at YouTube. They have kind of a crude
Yep.
editor. I guess I can
Yep.
just take that out.
Yeah, you should be able to do that. Yeah.
If I can't, can I ask you? I think
Yes.
I can.
Yes.
It's
Because
very crude. It is very crude, and I'm not,
Hmm.
the finesse of having, I can't put in a sign saying that I had to take that out. It didn't show, but you could do that. So if you would.
probably. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Oh, one other little note, aside from be sure and subscribe to Phil's little most popular in the UK Ray Bradbury blog. I hope I'm subscribed to it. If I'm not, I intend to. Is to look for our plays as they come out. And also one of our speakers, unfortunately, he's not going to be until March of next year, is a surreal painter who is he's a well-known, he's getting like Ray Bradbury. Everybody wants him for their science fiction covers. His name is Alan M. Clark. And he does the same technique as Ray Bradbury. You will be happy to know, Phil. He does surreal backgrounds, and then he comes back in and puts figurative, and he calls them controlled accidents. So it's literally the visual equivalent of what Bradbury used. And I'm doing that now with my visual art. I'm doing controlled accidents and I'm working into them. So it's a way not to have painter's block. That's every bit as real as writer's block. So thank
Bill,
you, everyone.
Bill?
Oh, go ahead.
I just figured out how to unmute on this phone. Is your blog also the best way to get some kind of background context for the work you're doing now?
Probably not, because I haven't really blogged about this. I think that the best way to see that work is to look at Gloria's YouTube channel, because that's where we
get you're on the list already for our news of the group. We
Right.
don't have a separate newsletter for Planet Zoom. Maybe we should. I don't know.
Okay, that's good. I need more context to understand what you're doing.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we'll have
Thank
to
you.
maybe we could work on having a very periodic, not very often, but periodic, maybe once per production newsletter from the Planet Zoom players to all the people in my big mailing list.
I may have actors too.
Oh, you may know some actors, did you say?
Well, actors, performers who would want to try out what you're doing.
I'll tell them all. You have my email. You will have it when I send you I guess you have it already because you're on the list.
Sure, I do.
Okay, well, see, this is a chance for us to be fishing. Fishing for new actors and anybody, tech people, because I'm sure there are times Phil wishes he had a second pair of hands, right? Somebody who you could give more rudimentary parts of the so we're also looking, we're not trying to unseat you because you're the maestro of it, but just for some of the more routine little jobs that I'm sure you could be like the tech wizard, and then you can have the sorcerer's apprentices, a couple of them helping you out. That would be great. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. And we don't want to keep you from your rest of your Saturday, but I think this was a good one. It was a big surprise. And I hope you're all pleasantly surprised. So we'll see you next time. And next time is, let me check. What's next time? I think next time's a big one. I should mention it to you. Next time is Joe Trimble and Joe Moe. And they go back to first fandom in Hollywood and Los Angeles. They are like the Encyclopedia Galactica of the whole field of science fiction from its early times in the LA and Hollywood area. So be sure and come. That will be August 3rd. Joe Moe and Joe Trimble will be there for you. So thanks so much. And I will now say so long and end the meeting.